In Goodfellas, there is one man who makes every scene feel unstable the moment he walks in. Tommy DeVito doesn't need power, rank, or permission. His presence alone is enough to freeze the room. He jokes too loudly. He smiles too long. And when the laughter stops, someone usually ends up dead. On screen, that volatility is thrilling. It keeps audiences locked in, because chaos feels dangerous, and danger feels exciting when it isn't happening to you. But this is where the illusion begins. Because Tommy DeVito was not just a character, he was a reflection of a real man, Thomas DeSimone, and the truth behind that reflection is far darker than the film ever allowed. Hollywood framed his violence as personality. Real life recorded it as a problem that could not be controlled. The movie teaches us to believe that unpredictability equals dominance, that the most feared man is the most powerful one. But in the real Mafia, fear without discipline is fatal. Order matters more than intimidation. Permission matters more than bravado. And Thomas DeSimone broke those rules again and again. He didn't just scare enemies, he endangered the entire structure around him. On screen, Tommy's explosions feel spontaneous, almost funny in their shock value. Off-screen, DeSimone's violence created consequences that could not be undone. People were killed who were not supposed to be touched. Lines were crossed that were never meant to be crossed. And once that happens, no reputation, no matter how terrifying, can save you. This is not a story about a wild gangster who went too far. It is a story about how cinema turns instability into charisma, and how reality responds by erasing the very people movies turn into legends. Because the real Goodfella was never the loudest man in the room. He was the one who survived long enough to stay invisible. In Goodfellas, Tommy DeVito is not written as a criminal who climbs the hierarchy, he is written as a force of nature. The film does not explain him, it unleashes him. From his first moments on screen, Tommy is framed as a man who cannot be contained by rules, rank, or consequence. He interrupts conversations, he dominates space, he turns ordinary situations into moments of pure tension. The audience never knows what he will do next, and that uncertainty is exactly the point. Hollywood understands something fundamental about attention. Unpredictability keeps viewers locked in. Every scene with Tommy DeVito carries an unspoken threat that it could spiral into violence at any second. Jokes become tests, compliments become traps, laughter becomes a warning sign. This constant instability makes Tommy the most watchable character in the film, even when he is clearly the most dangerous one. Crucially, the movie frames this chaos as charisma. Tommy's violence is not random, it is theatrical. His outbursts arrive suddenly, but they are edited for maximum shock and release. The audience is startled, then relieved, then impressed. Fear is transformed into entertainment through rhythm, music, and timing. Violence is no longer a consequence, it is a punchline. And that transformation is what makes the character iconic. On screen, Tommy DeVito's lack of control is treated as a kind of power. He doesn't need permission because no one dares to deny him. He doesn't follow hierarchy because hierarchy bends around him. This creates a seductive illusion that true dominance comes from being untouchable, from refusing restraint, from living without limits. In cinematic terms, Tommy becomes the embodiment of freedom through intimidation. But this framing quietly rewrites how power actually works. The film minimizes structure to amplify personality. Orders, rules, and consequences fade into the background, replaced by explosive moments that feel personal rather than systemic. The criminal world of Goodfellas begins to resemble a playground for extreme personalities instead of a tightly managed organization obsessed with control. This is why Tommy DeVito becomes the most memorable figure in the film, not because he represents how the Mafia truly functions, but because he represents what audiences are drawn to most. Danger without responsibility, violence without aftermath, and chaos that never turns inward on the person creating it. The problem is simple. This version of Tommy DeVito could only exist on screen, because in the real world, chaos is not admired, it is removed. And that is where the story of Thomas DeSimone begins to break away from the myth. Outside the cinematic frame, Thomas DeSimone was not a charismatic wildcard, he was a problem. He did not command respect. He generated fear. And in the real mafia, fear, without control, is not power. It is a liability that eventually has to be removed. DeSimone's reputation was built not on strategy or discipline, but on unchecked violence, impulsive decisions, and a consistent inability to understand limits. Unlike his on-screen counterpart, DeSimone held no official rank. He was not a made man. He operated on the margins, protected temporarily by higher figures, who found his brutality useful until it became inconvenient. His violence was not calculated to send messages. It was reactive, often personal, and frequently unauthorized. That distinction mattered. In organized crime, killings are not expressions of emotion, they are transactions that require approval. DeSimone ignored that rule repeatedly. The most dangerous aspect of DeSimone's behavior was not the violence itself, but who it targeted. He crossed lines that were meant to remain absolute. He killed individuals connected to powerful families. He acted without clearance. He created consequences that others were forced to manage. Each incident narrowed the space between him and elimination. Protection in the Mafia is conditional, and DeSimone burned through that protection faster than anyone could replace it. What the film portrays as explosive personality was, in reality, structural instability. DeSimone made everyone around him vulnerable, the crews that worked with him, the leaders who tolerated him, and the alliances that relied on predictability. His presence increased scrutiny, his actions increased retaliation, and his unpredictability increased risk in a system designed to minimize it. This is the critical truth Hollywood leaves out. The Mafia does not reward recklessness. It weaponizes it briefly, then disposes of it. DeSimone was not feared because he was powerful. He was feared because he could not be trusted to stop. And that made him unsustainable. Even those who benefited from his violence understood the math. Every unauthorized killing created pressure from above. Every crossed boundary demanded resolution. Eventually, the cost of keeping DeSimone alive outweighed the utility of his brutality. At that point, the decision was no longer emotional. It was administrative. The legend suggests that men like Thomas DeSimone burn out because they go too far. The reality is colder. They are removed because they cannot be controlled. And in a world where control is everything, that is the one crime that guarantees a silent ending. In the Mafia, protection is never permanent. It is conditional, transactional, and constantly reevaluated. Thomas DeSimone survived as long as he did, not because he was feared, but because others found him temporarily useful. That distinction is critical. The moment usefulness turns into liability, protection evaporates no matter how violent or intimidating someone may be. At first, DeSimone's brutality served a purpose. He enforced discipline through terror, silenced problems quickly, and did work that others preferred not to be directly associated with. Men above him could point him in a direction and let fear do the rest. But this arrangement depended on one rule: violence had to remain controllable. DeSimone never understood that limit. He acted first, explained later if at all, and every time he did, the people shielding him were forced to answer for consequences they did not authorize. The Mafia is often misunderstood as a world ruled by emotion. In reality, it is ruled by risk management. Killings require permission not because of morality, but because each one triggers retaliation, police attention, and internal instability. DeSimone violated this logic repeatedly. He killed without clearance. He killed the wrong people. And most dangerously, he killed individuals connected to families with the power to demand retribution. At that point, fear became irrelevant. The math no longer worked. Those who protected DeSimone directly or indirectly began to absorb the cost of his behavior. Meetings became tense. Questions started traveling upward. Silence became harder to maintain. In a hierarchy built on order, DeSimone represented uncontrolled exposure. His presence invited scrutiny. His reputation attracted attention. And attention is the one thing organized crime is designed to avoid. Hollywood presents loyalty as personal. Reality treats it as structural. No one is protected because they are liked. They are protected because they do not endanger the system. Once DeSimone crossed that line, sentiment no longer mattered. Even fear no longer mattered. What mattered was restoring stability, and that required removing the source of instability entirely. There is also a darker truth the film never addresses. DeSimone had no formal status to fall back on. He was not a made man. He did not carry institutional immunity. His value came from what he could do, not who he was. And when what he did became more dangerous than useful, there was nothing left to shield him. In Mafia terms, he was expendable. The decision to eliminate DeSimone was not dramatic. It did not require debate or passion. It was the final step in a process that had already concluded. Once enough lines were crossed, the outcome was inevitable. Not because he was violent, but because his violence could no longer be directed. This is the truth behind the myth. The mob didn't fail to protect Thomas DeSimone. They chose not to. And when that choice was made, the ending was already written. Unlike the explosive ending audiences remember from Goodfellas, the real conclusion of Thomas DeSimone did not arrive with noise, spectacle, or witnesses. It arrived with silence. No arrest record, no public body, no official announcement. Just a sudden absence that everyone inside the underworld understood without needing it explained. In organized crime, disappearance is often the clearest verdict there is. By the mid-1970s, the decision had already been made, even if it was never spoken aloud. DeSimone had crossed too many lines, angered the wrong people, and created consequences that could not be contained. The system no longer needed his brutality, and it could no longer afford the risk of keeping him alive. What followed was not a dramatic punishment, but a procedural resolution. A problem was identified, a solution was executed, order was restored. The mythology later claimed that DeSimone was called in for a ceremony, a symbolic reward for loyalty that would finally legitimize him. Whether that specific detail is true matters less than what it represents. The Mafia does not announce executions, it removes variables. Once DeSimone stepped into that final moment, he was already finished, not emotionally, not impulsively, but administratively. His story ended the moment the system decided it could no longer absorb him. What makes this ending so unsettling is how little it resembles the film. On screen, Tommy DeVito's death is shocking, sudden, and personal. It feels like karma. In reality, there was no lesson being taught, only risk being eliminated. No one needed to make a statement. No one needed to send a message. DeSimone's existence itself had become the message. After he vanished, life continued seamlessly for everyone else. Operations resumed. Alliances stabilized. The absence created calm. That is the clearest indication of how the Mafia viewed him, in the end, not as a fallen legend, but as an instability that had finally been corrected. The organization did not mourn him, it adjusted around him, as if he had never been meant to last. This is the fate Hollywood rarely explores. Not the dramatic downfall, but the quiet erasure. DeSimone was not remembered inside the system for how terrifying he was, but for how inevitable his ending became once fear replaced control. And in the Mafia, inevitability is the closest thing there is to justice. By the time Goodfellas reached global audiences, Thomas DeSimone no longer existed as a man, he existed as a character. Renamed Tommy DeVito, his history was compressed, reshaped, and repackaged into something far more marketable than the truth. The murders became moments. The instability became personality. And the consequences were quietly erased to preserve momentum, humor, and cinematic rhythm. This transformation was not subtle. Hollywood stripped away context and left spectacle. In reality, DeSimone's violence triggered fear inside his own organization, forced negotiations between families, and ultimately demanded his removal. On screen, that same violence becomes an entertaining wildcard, shocking, funny, and endlessly quotable. The audience is not asked to sit with aftermath. They are asked to remember the energy. The most dangerous edit Hollywood made was removal of cost. Victims are reduced to plot devices. Their families disappear entirely. Community impact never enters the frame. Without consequence, brutality becomes style. Without aftermath, chaos becomes charisma. The character survives in memory precisely because the film refuses to show what his existence actually destroyed. This is not accidental. Cinema thrives on focus, and complexity interferes with identification. By isolating Tommy DeVito as a singular force, the film avoids implicating the wider system, the hierarchy that tolerated him, the rules he violated, and the reason he had to be erased. The audience is left with an illusion that men like Tommy burn brightly and die dramatically. The truth is colder. They are managed, corrected, and forgotten. Ironically, this cleanup elevated DeSimone beyond anything he achieved in life. He failed as a Mafia asset. He became immortal as a movie character. Quotes replaced court records. Scenes replaced testimony. And over time, the fictional version eclipsed the real one completely. Few viewers remember that the man behind the character was considered a mistake, not a legend. This is the final distortion. Hollywood did not just tell DeSimone's story, it rescued it from accountability. By turning a liability into an icon, the film ensured that the most dangerous aspect of his life was not the violence itself, but how easily it could be reframed as entertainment. In the real world, Thomas DeSimone was erased because he could not be controlled. On screen, Tommy DeVito lives forever because control was never required. That difference explains everything. By the end of this story, the contrast could not be sharper. Tommy DeVito, the character audiences remember, exists as pure cinematic energy, unpredictable, violent, unforgettable. He lives forever because films do not have to live with consequences. They cut away. They move on. They leave destruction behind without returning to count the cost. What remains is excitement, not responsibility. Thomas DeSimone, the real man, left no such legacy. Inside the Mafia, he was not remembered as a legend, a rebel, or an icon. He was remembered as a failure of control, a liability, a risk that grew too large to tolerate. His disappearance was not punishment or tragedy, it was correction. The system adjusted, stabilized, and continued as if he had never been meant to survive in the first place. This is why the story matters beyond crime, history, or film analysis. It exposes how easily violence becomes entertainment when stripped of context, and how quickly instability becomes charisma when no one is forced to live with the aftermath. Hollywood did not invent Tommy DeVito's brutality, it edited out its meaning. And in doing so, it transformed a cautionary figure into a cultural favorite. The real Goodfella was never the loudest man in the room. He was never the most frightening. He was the one who understood restraint, hierarchy, and timing, the qualities that keep systems intact. Thomas DeSimone had none of them, and that is why he vanished. What cinema celebrates, reality eliminates. What audiences applaud, organizations quietly erase. And somewhere between those two truths lies the uncomfortable line between storytelling and accountability, a line Hollywood crosses far more often than it admits.